Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Kabatagwe. A recent report has indicated that the U.S. dropped record number of bombs in Afghanistan last year. Now, this has been accompanied by an increase in civilian casualties attributed to U.S. forces. This comes even though the U.S. is supposedly in peace talks with the Taliban and wants to also withdraw from the country to end the longest war in their history. In this edition of the debate, we will look at why the U.S. has ramped up their war campaign in that country and if they truly are sincere in declaring their desire to withdraw their forces from that country. For guests joining us for this edition of the debate, we will welcome them both. If I may start with the first guest and get reaction from you based on the stat that we have, that the U.S. dropped more bombs. Let me start with you, Samueli. The U.S. dropped more bombs on Afghanistan in 2019 than any other year since the Pentagon began keeping a tally in 2006. Why do you think, first of all, what's your reaction to this particular stat?
Well, this is clearly part of President Trump's strategy of trying to work out a deal with the Taliban on the basis of strength. So if the United States drops bombs and the United States inflicts serious casualties, then should the U.S. withdraw, it can say that it withdrew on the basis of strength, that it wasn't a craven withdrawal following defeat on the battlefield. It was on the basis of from a position of strength. That, I think, is the theory underlying it. I don't think it's terribly plausible, because I don't think that there's any real prospect of the United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan anytime soon. And for all of President Trump's talk of his passionate desire to withdraw from Afghanistan, I don't think he's planning on any withdrawal anytime in the near future.
Well, let's break this down a little bit, Tony Gosling, in terms of the fact that so many bombs were dropped on that country after 19 years. Aside from the fact that I'd like to hear from you what type of strategy that is. But we're looking at 7,423 bombs and other munitions, which is nearly an eightfold increase. That comes to about 20 bombs a day. What type of strategy is that? What purpose does the U.S. have behind bombing this country on a daily basis? If that occurred on a daily basis, maybe not. But again, in total, that's what it amounts to. Okay, Tony Gosling, I'm going to repeat the question. The fact that last year the most bombs were dropped by the U.S. in Afghanistan translates to a little over 7,400 bombs. Breaking that down, that comes out to be about 20 bombs per day. Can you please, if you can, tell us what type of strategy that is after 19 years of war?
Well, it's not a strategy at all. What it is an attempt to occupy and dominate poor old Afghanistan. There's very little power within the country. What we saw in 2001 with the initial invasion there was a very cynical exercise by the United States. They knew that the Russians were very weak. They just had the new President Putin had just kind of started there after many years of Yeltsin and really the rape of the country by the oligarchs in Russia. So they knew the Russians were weak, and they decided they're going to take an opportunity to seek a strategic point on the map, and that's really all it is in Asia. Afghanistan is a place which is right next to Iran, it's next to the Russians, and of course it threatens actually China too. So, you know, if you can imagine a wish list of American bases around the world, you'll find Afghanistan top of the list. I think that that's why they're still there, and I would also make some comparisons with the Vietnam conflict, because it's quite clear now to historians that Vietnam was an unwinnable war, and that really the only reasons that the United States went into Vietnam, along with the French, of course, they were involved in what was previously French Indochina, was to control opium supplies and to actually be involved in making sure that the drug traffickers in the United States got good supplies of opium. And I think exactly the same can be said for Afghanistan, very important opium growing region that the Taliban back in 2001 had almost stopped completely the growing of opium. They've made a very, very good job as a domestic country in stopping the production of opium from Afghanistan. And so somebody in Washington, probably in Chicago mafia land somewhere in Washington, decided, okay, so we want regime change in Afghanistan. And that's when the 9/11 events took place, which were really spun completely. So they said, oh, bin Laden is in Afghanistan, he did it. And so almost within days, there was a talk of invading Afghanistan, and they've been there ever since. I think really it's much more to do with growing opium, supplying the black markets of the mafia of the world, than it has anything to do with any laudable motives. And it's about world domination by the United States. That's what they want. Regime change means they can just tick off another box of another country they control.
So, George Samioli, one of the biggest questions that has been asked, and it's a very perplexing one, if unless the U.S. has ulterior motives, as our guest there said, for example, the drug trade, i.e. opium trade being one of the incentives, is that how could the U.S. and its coalition partners, which at one point totaled 150,000, not able to defeat the Taliban, which at best would roughly be about 10,000 fighters?
Been the bane of empires in the past. It's a very difficult country to control. It's a very mountainous terrain. The people are mountain people, and they're very independent-minded. The British weren't able to do it. The Soviet Union wasn't able to do it. And of course, the United States hasn't been any more successful. What's really going on is a continuation of the fight to control Afghanistan that's been going on for now a couple of 100 years. And remember, both the British and the Russians wanted to control Afghanistan in the 19th century. They saw it as key to their geopolitical power, that if you control Afghanistan, then you have a route towards India and then into East Asia. And of course, then it enables you to control the Persian Gulf. So that's really what Afghanistan was about. So in itself, there's nothing terribly valuable there. I mean, yes, it's true about the opium, but it's the most important aspect of Afghanistan is its geopolitical location. And so what the United States is seeking to do is, by controlling Afghanistan, is to be able to, well, first of all, to deny access to the Gulf for Russia, and it also enables the United States to exert pressure on Iran from the east. I mean, it's already, the United States is able to pressure Iran from the west in Iraq, but then it also has an ability to pressure from the east. So losing Afghanistan for the United States would mean, as Washington sees it, a great geostrategic victory for Russia and a great victory for Iran. That's why it's a near impossibility to think of the United States letting go and just saying, oh, well, we're out of here. Taliban comes in, doesn't come in, we really don't care. It just isn't going to happen. For all the political talk, well, where we're going to get out, we'll be out by the end of the year. There's a reason why it hasn't happened, and it's been almost 20 years. There's no real prospect of this happening.
Well, Tony Gosling, the U.S. president, has said that he wants to pull troops out of there, and actually you are having these so-called talks that are taking place between the U.S. and the Taliban, although it's been on again, off again, especially when you have U.S. soldiers that are killed. And in particular, for example, this incident that involved the downing of a U.S. special aircraft that is said to have the U.S. intelligence officers on board. There was talk of this Ayatollah Mike who maybe have been killed. And the Taliban have said that they were responsible for it, even though the U.S. has confirmed that they were the ones who who were responsible for bringing it down. Tell us, first of all, what you think about that incident before we go on any further, if indeed the Taliban was responsible for bringing down this U.S. Special aircraft.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know enough of the details. I think very few people do to say who was actually responsible for it. But, you know, these kinds of incidents always seem to happen, don't they? Donald Trump makes a big announcement to his public and to the world saying, I want to pull out of wherever it happens to be. I mean, actually, he was elected on pulling out of all these foreign wars. He said that we'd had enough of them. He talked about the billions, the tens of billions, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent on these wars. And then something always happens. Oh, dear, well, we can't pull out now. I mean, we had the chemical weapons fake chemical weapons attack, I should say, in Douma in Syria, in fact, 2 over the years, in order to say, well, actually, we can't quite pull out yet. So there always seems to be some excuse. It's a rather shabby tactic, I would suggest, that we really, there is no believing what Donald Trump says, mainly because he doesn't really seem to be in charge, although he's president. And if he was to give all these orders, there would be an attempt to move these troops out. There are much, much more powerful forces at the Pentagon. We're talking also about the enormous money that goes into the lobby, the pro-war lobby in Washington, and it would be almost impossible for him to do so. So he can make an announcement all he likes, but it's almost certainly not going to happen. I think we should also remember, of course, that the Taliban and Afghanistan is a Muslim country. And what we've seen ever since the turn of the century is a real assault on these various Muslim nations by the United States and Israel and by the UK too. And I mean, we are starting to deal with, I think, an Islamophobia within the, should we say, Anglo-Zionist empire that is slowly coming to dawn here in the UK. I think at least that there's all the talk about anti-Semitism, but actually Islamophobia has been driving foreign policy. And the idea really is, I think, that it's the values and the spiritual values and the civil society values that Islam stands for that the Americans want to destroy. They want to impose their own values, a commercial world, a commercial value on all these countries. So it is a geopolitical thing. Obviously, they want that particular spot on the world they think is an important place to control, to threaten other countries. But there is also this spiritual aspect, which I think many commentators miss. And also, of course, the role of the mass media in the West, which never puts these conflicts in context. It will talk about a specific incident, but it will never, ever look at the historical view, take a step back, and look at the real power structures and the real geopolitics, the game playing that's going on. And actually, game theory does feature a lot, I think, in American thinking. They see this as a big war game they're playing, kind of almost on a risk board, if anyone's ever played that game, where they're trying to win specific countries and ticking them off as they go. And the mainstream media is massively complicit in that. In fact, whenever it's a new regime change that they do, like just as happened with Afghanistan back in 2001, the media are at the forefront in selling this war to the public as some kind of just cause, and then it all kind of gets forgotten about, as we've seen particularly with Libya, actually, over the last 7 or 8 years. Very little coverage of what's chaos has been caused there by NATO and the Western countries. So the media is absolutely complicit in all this. I would say really the spearhead of the war machine. The first bite is where the media attacks the country, excuses an invasion, and I'm afraid the United Nations is very much on the back foot. They seem to be more concerned with climate change than stopping World War III.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to do a flashback here. If you recall, George Samiali, you had this U.S. general by the name of Stanley McChrystal, and what he became famous for was this winning the hearts and minds of Afghans. I don't know if you recall that. And that was something that he said that needs to be done. But that didn't really happen, did it? I mean, when you take a look at some of the stats that came out of Afghanistan, which kept getting repeated, at the top of the list, obviously, was the fact that you have civilian casualties. Back to the topic of this debate, where you have the most number of bombs dropped in a period of 1 year last year. You also had, along with it, over 1,200 casualties as a result of these U.S. bombs being dropped. Don't you think that that is one of the reasons why then that the U.S. has not been able to win this war?
Well, of course. that that's the case. The hearts and minds cliche goes together with all of U.S. military interventions. I mean, hearts and minds was a big thing during the Vietnam War. Well, the United States has to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. Well, how are you going to win the hearts and minds of people of whom you know nothing? You don't know anything about their culture. You don't know anything about the history. You don't know their language. You don't know what they really want. I mean, and of course, you don't win their hearts and minds because you're not even interested in winning their hearts and minds. It's all part of a geopolitical game. I mean, at no point has the United States ever really taken an interest in Afghan society or Afghan culture, despite its attempts to seize on the fashionable issues of the moment. So the United States likes to talk about, oh, we're there in order to defend Afghan women. So that sounds good, and and the American public think, oh, well, that sounds reasonable. It's helping Afghan women. Of course, then they find out, or chances are they won't find out because the media won't tell them, that in fact there's been a massive step backward for women in Afghanistan since the U.S. intervention. So, women in Afghanistan were far better off back in the 1970s and 80s, when first it had a pro-Soviet regime, and then it was actually dominated by the Soviet Union. So, there's been a giant step back for women. So, in the same way, we talk about hearts and minds, and now we find out that the United States has been turning a blind eye to essentially man-boy rape that has been taking place under U.S. auspices. At U.S. military installations, the Americans have been turning a blind eye because they really didn't care very much, as long as they could get their loyal Afghan proxies to fight for them. They didn't really care very much that there was rape taking place at U.S. installations. So we really don't want to take any of these claims seriously. So as to hearts and minds, it's always a geostrategic calculation, and there is a kind of a patina of supposedly humanitarian intent. Oh, we're bringing a more decent, civilized society there. We're going to look after young men. We're going to look after women. It just isn't true. That's just not the way the U.S. Approaches other countries.
Just a little less than a month ago, or maybe about a month ago, Tony Gosselin, finally you got the mother of all stories when it came to Afghanistan, so to speak, and that was the revelation of what Washington Post fought for 3 years, and it was the release of the Afghan papers. And it was very eye-opening to finally have the truth come out of how much lying was going on when it came to U.S. officials from the bottom up, whether it came to anything that had to deal with the Afghan war, that it was a failure, but they had to cover it up in the way they discussed it, from all the money that was being wasted, of which nothing really came out of it when it came to infrastructure, for example, and just how the U.S. was winning this war. The Afghan papers obviously shed a light on the truth of the matter. And who knows how far and how deep the U.S. has lied about other things, perhaps, when you have this type of falsifications going on. What was your reaction when the Afghan papers revealed all these eye-opening truths?
Well, good question. And let me remind you of the American journalist Michael Hastings, who died in a very mysterious car crash. It looked as if his Mercedes had been hacked and driven through Los Angeles at 80, 90 miles an hour and remotely controlled, driven into a tree because the local police filmed it, and he had his foot on the foot brake, and the brake lights were on, so he was trying to stop the car. He was exposing all of this stuff now. We're talking about nearly 5 years ago now, maybe even 6 years ago. He was starting to expose it. He was making exposing the lies that were being told by the military to the president. And that I suppose is in a way a sort of swan song for Michael, is that this stuff is now come out through the Afghan papers finally, it's taken a long time, but it's the work that he was doing to expose that, I think, that got him killed, assassinated back in, 6, 7 years ago. So that was the first thought I saw, is at last the work that Michael Hastings was trying to do, the US journalist, is finally coming out. But look, you've also got a major problem over in Afghanistan, and that is air control of the air. I mean, this is what we've seen, is if you don't control the air, the Afghan people, governments, or the Russians, or some other superpower that's involved, has got to control the airspace. If you don't control the air above you, the Americans will fly their drones in and start assassinating people they don't like. That's essentially what goes on. They will drop drone bombs on funeral parties, on wedding parties, anywhere. They also have this double tap system whereby they will drop one bomb, a Hellfire missile from a drone or an aircraft, and then when everyone is trying to rescue people, then they drop another one right in the middle of the rescue operation. This is the US tactic, really to attempt to utterly demoralize people. It's quite clear that it's not going to work, certainly not in Afghanistan. All it does is it galvanizes more and more support for people like the Taliban, anyone who's prepared to resist that sort of invasion. And hence, many of the Air Force pilots simply will not do these sorts of missions, hence why they have to use drones. And I think that's one of the hidden things about the new tactics the US are using, is that there is no human being who would actually like to get involved with this, which is why they're trying to use artificial intelligence to bring about drone swarms who will do these hideous attacks and murders and killings, which are of course completely illegal under international law, and those who are involved in them, even programming computers that do them, are likely at some point, maybe not right now, but in the future, to be put behind bars. And the Americans are moving out into space, aren't they? We heard about the Space Force. It's because they're realizing that actually, even though they can control the air with drones, that other countries like the Russians with the S-400 missiles are making it more and more difficult for the Americans to operate in the air.
Thank you very much for that. That's Tony Gosling, investigative journalist there from Bristol. And thank you, George Samiali, author at Bombs for Peace, talking to us there from Budapest. And that does for this edition of The Debate. From me, Kaveh Tagway, it's goodbye until next time.